Imagine becoming Queen of Britain before you are old enough to understand what power truly means. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your entire life has changed. The people around you are no longer simply your family. They are advisors, politicians, servants, and people who want to influence every decision you make. This was the world of the young Queen Victoria. Victoria was born on the 24th of May 1819. From the beginning her life was connected to the British throne. But her childhood was far from the freedom people might imagine for a future queen. She grew up under strict supervision. Her mother and advisors controlled many parts of her life. She was rarely allowed to be alone. Her daily routine was carefully planned, and almost every decision was made for her. But Victoria had a strong personality. She did not like being controlled. She wanted independence. She wanted to make her own choices. And she would soon have the opportunity to do exactly that. In June 1837, King William IV died. Victoria was only 18 years old. She was now Queen of the United Kingdom. The moment she became queen, everything changed. The young girl who had spent her childhood under strict supervision suddenly became one of the most powerful women in Britain. She moved into Buckingham Palace. She began meeting government ministers. She attended official ceremonies. She studied political affairs. And slowly she began learning how to use the power of the crown. But Victoria quickly discovered that being queen was not easy. There were powerful men around her who believed that because she was young, they could influence her. Some believed she was too inexperienced to make important decisions. Others believed that they could control the young monarch. But Victoria was determined to prove them wrong. She wanted people to understand that although she was young, she was still the queen. Then Prince Albert entered her life. Albert was Victoria's first cousin. He was intelligent, well-educated, musical, and interested in science and technology. When Victoria saw Albert again in 1839, she was immediately attracted to him. But their relationship was different from an ordinary romance. Victoria was the queen. Albert could not propose to her. The decision had to come from Victoria. And she made that decision herself. She asked Albert to marry her. In February 1840, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were married. Their marriage became one of the most important royal partnerships in British history. Victoria loved Albert deeply. But Albert soon became much more than her husband. He became her closest advisor. He encouraged her to support education, science, art, technology, and industrial progress. Together they created a new image of the British monarchy. They became a royal family that the public could see. A family with children. A family that celebrated Christmas. A family that represented stability. But behind the beautiful public image, Victoria and Albert were also building something much larger. They were becoming symbols of a changing Britain. A Britain that was moving from an old world into a modern one. Railways were expanding. Factories were growing. New inventions were appearing. And London was becoming one of the greatest cities on earth. Victoria and Albert wanted the monarchy to be part of this new future. Then, in 1851, Albert helped organize the Great Exhibition. It brought inventions and industrial achievements from around the world to London. For Victoria, it was proof that Britain was entering a new age. But while the country was changing, Victoria's personal life was also changing. She and Albert had children. Their family grew. Their responsibilities increased. And their influence became stronger. For more than 20 years, Victoria believed Albert would always be beside her. She could not imagine her life without him. But history was about to take everything she knew and turn it upside down. Because in 1861, the Queen would face the greatest personal tragedy of her life. And the woman who had once depended on Albert would be forced to discover who she really was without him. By the beginning of the 1860s, Queen Victoria had become one of the most recognizable women in Britain. She had ruled for more than 20 years. She had a large family. She had a powerful husband beside her. And Britain was entering a period of extraordinary change. But Victoria's private world was about to collapse. Prince Albert had always been an important part of her life. He was not simply her husband. He was the person she trusted with her deepest thoughts. He advised her on politics. He helped her understand difficult decisions. And he worked constantly to improve the image of the monarchy. Victoria depended heavily on him. Then Albert became ill. At first there was hope that he would recover. Victoria stayed close to him. She watched over him. She believed that somehow he would get better. But his condition continued to deteriorate. In December 1861, Prince Albert died. He was only 42 years old. Victoria was completely devastated. The man who had shared more than 20 years of her life was suddenly gone. For Victoria, the world seemed to stop. She withdrew from public life. She left London for long periods. She wore black. And she surrounded herself with memories of Albert. His rooms were preserved. His personal belongings were carefully maintained. Everything reminded her of the life they had shared. But Britain could not stop simply because the Queen was grieving. The country needed its monarch. Parliament continued working. Political arguments continued. The empire continued expanding. And the British public expected Victoria to return. At first they were sympathetic. But as the years passed, some people began asking difficult questions. Why was the Queen hiding from the public? Why did she rarely appear at important events? Could the monarchy continue like this? Newspapers became increasingly critical. Victoria was hurt. She believed that people had forgotten that behind the crown was a human being. A woman who had lost the person she loved most. But Victoria slowly realized something important. Albert was gone. But her responsibilities remained. She could not bring him back. She could not stop her grief. But she could choose what she would do next. And slowly, she began returning to public life. She continued wearing black. She continued mourning Albert. But she also began working again. Her personality changed. The young queen who had once relied heavily on Albert was becoming a more experienced monarch. She began understanding politics more deeply. She learned how to deal with ministers. She learned how to protect the position of the monarchy. And she became increasingly confident in her own authority. The tragedy that had broken her had also changed her. Victoria no longer needed to be seen simply as Albert's wife. She was Queen Victoria. And she was beginning to understand the power of that position. Meanwhile, Britain was changing at an incredible speed. Railways connected cities. Factories expanded. New technologies transformed communication. London grew larger. The British Empire continued to expand. And Victoria's name became connected with an entire historical period. The Victorian Age. But Victoria's influence would soon extend far beyond Britain. Her children were growing up. Her daughters and sons were marrying into European royal families. Her grandchildren would eventually become connected to royal houses across Europe. Victoria was becoming the grandmother of a royal network that stretched across the continent. Yet she still remained deeply involved in her children's lives. She could be loving, protective, and sometimes extremely controlling. She wanted to know everything about their marriages, their health, their families, and their political connections. She believed she was protecting them. But some of her children felt that their mother wanted to control their lives. Victoria's relationship with her family would become one of the most complicated parts of her later reign. And then came another transformation. In 1876, Victoria received a new imperial title. She became Empress of India. The title reflected the enormous importance of India within the British Empire. Victoria was fascinated by Indian culture. And later in life she developed an unusual friendship with Abdul Karim, a young Indian servant who eventually became one of the people closest to her. The relationship would shock members of the royal household. But Victoria refused to simply follow their wishes. She was now an experienced queen. She had survived the greatest loss of her life. She had learned to rule without Albert. And she was determined to make her own decisions. The girl who had once been controlled by others had become a queen who expected others to listen to her. But as Victoria entered the final decades of her reign, another question began to emerge. How would Britain remember her when she was gone? Would she be remembered only as Albert's grieving widow, or as the powerful queen who had transformed Britain? The answer would become clear only in the final years of her extraordinary reign. By the late 19th century, Queen Victoria was no longer the inexperienced girl who had inherited the British throne at 18. She had become an experienced monarch, a mother, a grandmother, and one of the most recognizable rulers in the world. But Britain itself had changed enormously during her reign. When Victoria first became queen, the country was entering the Industrial Revolution. By the later years of her reign, Britain had become a global industrial and imperial power. Railways connected cities. Steamships crossed oceans. Factories produced goods on an enormous scale. Telegraph messages could travel across continents. And London had become a center of global finance and politics. Victoria's name became connected with this transformation. The Victorian Age. But the British Empire was perhaps the most important part of her later reign. British influence stretched across enormous parts of the world. And India held a particularly important position. In 1876, Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. The new title strengthened the connection between Victoria and the empire. Her image appeared throughout Britain and across imperial territories. But Victoria's interest in India became much more personal later in her life. In 1887, during the celebrations of her Golden Jubilee, a young Indian man named Abdul Karim arrived in Britain. He had originally been sent to serve the Queen. But Victoria quickly became fascinated by him. She wanted to learn about India. She wanted to understand Indian customs. And she wanted to learn the Hindustani language. Abdul became her teacher, her munshi. Their relationship became increasingly close. Victoria wrote about him. She defended him. And she gave him a level of influence that shocked members of the royal household. Her family did not approve. Some servants were uncomfortable. They believed Abdul had become too close to the Queen. But Victoria refused to allow them to control the relationship. She had spent most of her childhood being told what she could and could not do. She was not going to surrender her decisions now. Victoria's relationship with Abdul also revealed something important about her personality. Behind the formal image of the Queen was a woman who remained curious. She wanted to learn. She wanted companionship. And she wanted people around her who treated her as a person rather than simply as a symbol. But while Victoria was developing these personal relationships, her family was becoming one of the most powerful royal networks in Europe. Her children married into foreign royal families. Her grandchildren became princes and princesses across Europe. Victoria eventually became known as the grandmother of Europe. Her descendants would later sit on several European thrones. Yet Victoria's influence over her family could sometimes become difficult. She worried constantly about their marriages. She wanted to know where they were going, who they were marrying, and how their decisions might affect the monarchy. She believed that royal marriages were not simply matters of love. They could affect international politics. They could strengthen alliances, or create problems between countries. Victoria understood the political importance of her family. But she also understood the power of the monarchy's image. The public wanted to see a stable royal family. Victoria represented tradition, duty, family, and continuity. She had survived the death of Albert. She had survived years of criticism. And she had returned to public life stronger than before. But Victoria's reign was not without controversy. The British Empire continued expanding. And the relationship between Britain and its colonies was complicated. There were wars, political disagreements, social changes, and growing debates about Britain's role in the world. Victoria herself became a symbol of the empire. But behind that symbol was an elderly woman who had already lived through enormous personal and political changes. She had been queen for decades, and she had watched an entire generation grow up around her. The world she entered in 1837 was disappearing. A new modern world was emerging, and Victoria was now its oldest symbol. By the 1890s, her reign had become almost legendary. She had ruled longer than most people could remember. Crowds celebrated her jubilees. Her portraits were displayed everywhere, and her name had become part of British identity. But time was running out. Victoria was growing old. Her health was weakening, and the 20th century was approaching. The queen who had begun her reign as a young girl was now preparing to leave behind a world that had been transformed during her lifetime. But before she died, she would witness one final chapter. A chapter that would prove just how deeply Britain had come to identify itself with Queen Victoria. By the final years of the 19th century, Queen Victoria had become more than a monarch. She had become a symbol for generations of British people. Victoria was the only queen they had ever known. She had ruled Britain since 1837, and during those decades, the country had changed beyond recognition. When Victoria first became queen, people travelled mainly by horse and carriage. Communication across long distances could take days or weeks. Factories were still transforming the economy, and London looked very different from the city that would exist at the end of her reign. Now railways crossed the country. Steamships travelled across the oceans. Telegraph cables connected distant parts of the world. Factories filled industrial cities, and new inventions were appearing almost every year. Victoria had witnessed the birth of the modern world. But age was beginning to catch up with her. She was no longer the young woman who had ridden into London as queen. She was an elderly monarch. Her eyesight was weakening. Her health was declining, and she increasingly relied on family members and servants. Yet she continued working. She still read documents. She still followed political affairs. She still met important visitors, and she remained interested in the future of her family. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her. Many of them were now adults. Some had children of their own. Victoria had become the center of an enormous royal family. But there was one person she had never stopped missing: Prince Albert. Almost 40 years had passed since his death. Yet Victoria continued to remember him. She kept his belongings. She preserved his rooms. And she continued wearing black. To the outside world, her mourning had become part of her identity. But Victoria had also learned how to turn personal grief into public strength. She had returned to her duties. She had survived criticism. And she had continued ruling Britain. In 1887, Britain celebrated Victoria's Golden Jubilee. 50 years had passed since she became queen. The celebrations were enormous. Royal guests travelled from around the world. Crowds gathered in London. And Victoria appeared before the public as a symbol of stability. Then, in 1897, Britain celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. 60 years on the throne. The event was even larger. Representatives from across the empire came to London. Soldiers marched. Royal processions filled the streets. And enormous crowds gathered to see the Queen. Victoria had become a living connection between two different worlds. The young Britain of 1837, and the modern Britain of 1897. But while the celebrations showed the strength of her monarchy, Victoria's private life remained much quieter. She was aging. She spent more time at Osborne House. She preferred the privacy of her homes. And she continued to live with memories of the past. The people around her understood that the end of her reign was approaching. Yet Victoria continued to work. She refused to simply disappear. She had spent 60 years serving as queen, and she intended to continue for as long as she could. But by the beginning of 1901, Victoria's health had become much worse. She travelled to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Her family gathered around her. The The Queen, who had ruled for more than 6 decades, was now approaching the end of her life. News of her illness spread rapidly. Across Britain, people waited for updates. Newspapers followed every development, and millions remembered the woman who had been queen for almost their entire lives. Victoria had become part of British identity. Her death would mean more than the loss of a monarch. It would mean the end of an age. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died. She was 81 years old. Her reign had lasted 63 years and 7 months. She had become one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history. The Victorian age was over. But the story of Victoria was not finished, because Britain now had to say goodbye to the Queen who had defined an entire century. And the final journey of Queen Victoria would become one of the greatest royal ceremonies Britain had ever witnessed. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House. She was 81 years old, and she had ruled Britain for more than 63 years. For most people alive at that time, Victoria had always been their queen. They had grown up under her reign. Their parents had lived under her reign. And in many cases, even their grandparents had remembered the beginning of her rule. Now everything had changed. Britain had lost the woman who had become the symbol of an entire age. News of Victoria's death spread rapidly. Newspapers reported the tragedy. Crowds gathered in the streets. Flags were lowered. And across the British Empire, people mourned the passing of the Queen. Her funeral became a massive national event. Royal representatives traveled from across Europe. Kings, princes, princesses, soldiers, politicians, and thousands of ordinary people gathered to witness the final journey. But there was something deeply personal about Victoria's funeral. For decades she had lived with the memory of Prince Albert. She had lost him in 1861, and for almost 40 years she had carried that loss. Now she would finally be laid to rest beside him. Victoria was buried in the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, beside Prince Albert. The Queen, who had spent decades mourning her husband, was finally reunited with him. But while Victoria's personal story had ended, her historical legacy was only beginning. She had ruled during one of the greatest periods of transformation in British history. During her reign, Britain became an industrial superpower. Railways transformed travel. Factories changed the economy. New technologies changed communication. London became a global city, and the British Empire reached enormous size. Victoria's family also became part of European history. Her children and grandchildren married into royal families across the continent. This is why she became known as the grandmother of Europe. Her descendants would eventually become connected to the royal families of several European countries. But Victoria's legacy was not simply about power. It was also about the image of the British monarchy. She helped create an idea of monarchy centered around family, duty, tradition, and public responsibility. The monarchy had survived enormous political and social changes, and Victoria became one of the central reasons for its continued popularity. Yet her story was not perfect. She could be stubborn. She could be demanding. She sometimes struggled to understand the changing society around her. And her relationship with the British Empire remains part of a much more complicated history. But that complexity is what makes her story so fascinating. Victoria was not simply a perfect queen. She was a human being. She experienced love, jealousy, anger, loss, loneliness, and enormous responsibility. She became queen at 18. She married the man she loved. She built a large family. She lost her husband. She mourned him for decades. And yet she continued to rule. She watched the world around her transform. And she remained at the center of it. When Victoria died, the 19th century seemed to die with her. The 20th century had arrived. A new king would take the throne. New technologies would reshape society. And the old Victorian world would slowly disappear. But Victoria's name would remain. In buildings, in monuments, in photographs, in books, in museums, and in the history of Britain. She had entered the throne as a young girl, and left it as one of the most famous monarchs in British history. Her greatest achievement was perhaps not simply the length of her reign. It was the way she became connected with the identity of an entire generation. She was queen when Britain changed. She was queen when the empire expanded. She was queen when the modern world began to appear. And she remained queen until the very beginning of a new century. That is why Queen Victoria is remembered not simply as a woman who wore a crown, but as the queen who changed Britain.